Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Haysam Haider. I am a psychologist and executive member of Mission of Hope. This live community broadcast has been organized by the Lebanese Muslim Association and Mission of Hope in response to what occurred at Sydney Town Hall last Monday night, and the New South Wales government and police response that followed. The protest was held in the context of the invitation extended to Israeli President Isaac Herzog to visit Australia. For many Australians, that invitation was deeply distressing, given ongoing genocide in Gaza and the long-standing concerns regarding Palestinian civilian suffering, displacement, crimes against humanity. The protest was an expression of political dissent and solidarity with the Palestinian human rights movement. During that protest, many protesters were allegedly violently assaulted by police, as we have seen in many videos, in particular, the assault of Muslim men and women paused to pray. As has now been widely reported, those prayers were initially permitted by police. Footage later showed police officers physically interrupting and pulling men from prostration. The Law Enforcement Conduct Commission has since announced an investigation into the police response. For many Australians, they were horrified by the heavy-handedness by police, noting the distress did not just arise from disagreement over protest management, it also arose from the symbolism of prayer being disrupted during a politically charged moment and from what followed in the public narrative. In recent months, we have seen escalating political discussion around pro-Palestine related activism in Australia. There have been proposals at both New South Wales and Queensland state levels to ban certain protest chants linked to Palestinian solidarity. At the federal level, new hate speech legislation has been introduced with expanded penalties and broader definitions. While hate speech laws aim to address genuine harm, many Muslims are questioning how these frameworks will be applied and whether Palestinian political expression will be disproportionately scrutinized. At the same time, media coverage has often focused heavily on alleged threats or inflammatory language, while comparatively less attention has been given to the grief and humanitarian concerns motivating many protesters. When public commentary appears one-sided, communities may experience it as a dismissal rather than engagement. Psychologically, perceived double standards matter. When individuals believe their civic participation is treated differently from others, it affects their sense of fairness. When religious practice intersects with state force, it affects their sense of dignity. When political advocacy for Palestinian human rights is framed primarily through a security lens, it affects their sense of belonging. These reactions are not signs of fragility. They are predictable responses to perceived instability and unequal treatment. Research in trauma psychology shows that distress can spread collectively through identity-based experiences. The Muslim community in Australia has lived through decades of scrutinisation narrative, counter-terrorism legislation, and heightened scrutiny. In that broader context, Monday night was not interpreted as an isolated policing event. It intersected with memory and with current debates about protest rights, chant bans, anti-Semitism frameworks, and hate speech reform. Young people are observing this carefully. They are forming conclusions about whether their faith, their grief, and their political voice are equally protected in Australian democracy. Tonight is not about inflammatory or inflaming divisions. It is about acknowledging that these events have psychological consequences. It is about understanding the impact on mental health, on families, and on community cohesion. We are joined by Hanan Dover, clinical psychologist and clinical and forensic psychologist, as well as Dr. Yasser Morsi, academic and scholar of Islamophobia and political discourse. This is a respectful and reflective space. If at any time you feel overwhelmed, please take some time for self-care and step away and seek support if needed. Community well-being is our priority. Our aim tonight is not only to understand what has happened, but to ensure that we respond with clarity, dignity, and collective care. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start with you, Hanan, to begin. can you briefly explain why events like Monday night protest and the state response can have psychological impacts beyond those politically or physically present?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, Haitham and
Assalamu alaikum.
Yasser. I think tonight is very important to have this kind of discussion with our community. And in terms of the psychological impact of what took place on last Monday at Town Hall, for those who weren't physically present, we're talking about how that impacts our collective nervous system, because one can say it's a form of individual trauma. It's we process the imagery, we internalized how we might feel a sense of injustice. There could have been a lot of heightened anxiety, but collectively coming together, especially when we saw not only the protesters being, if I can be from Bankstown, bashed by police, even when we saw their hands going up, I think spiritually it was very confronting to see Sheikh Wissam Shakawi lead a prayer for Maghrib. As we know, it has a specified and designated time, and we know now that they had permission to pray, were actually violently assaulted by police. I think from a perspective of how we would react, I'm sure, no doubt, as you both, that we saw ourselves within the congregation of prayer. Yes, we didn't see the sisters in that space, but I think it would activate a threat response that we don't feel safe in Australia, even down to our act of worship, which we know, and we pray publicly many times. I prayed in airports, beaches, shopping centres, I never had a problem. So witnessing, observing, our Muslim brothers and sisters being violently attacked, even till today, I've been impacted. I mean, I automatically did what I do instinctively. I contacted Sheikh Wissam. When I saw the first brother being attacked, he's actually literally my office neighbor, Shabazz, and he's the most genuine, authentic, smiley brother. And to see him violently thrown, till today, it does affect me. And I think as a community, we have to understand that it's not only what happened on the ground, it's how we internalize those optics and those images. So even if we can't be protected by police when we're engaged in worship, we sort of have to question, where is it safe to practice, our faith if we can't do it in the public with police permission, and then to have it second guessed, and debated by Karl Stefanovic, for example, who suggested that Muslims were baiting police. I mean, that's a crazy thought, that we would use an act of worship to bait police. And the minimization by the Premier and the state police, who are in a position of authority, it would collectively make us feel like we're not heard. It'll heighten our hypervigilance when they're out in the community. We could change and modify our behavior when we're out in the public as well. And so it creates a system or an aura that, public is an unsafe space for Muslims.
Yes, sir. So why do events involving policing and public scrutiny affect Muslim communities in particular ways?
Yeah, good question. Very well spoken, Hanan. Thank you for that. Why do police affect us?
It's a bit of a redundant question.
Well, I think the obvious answer is because of the histories that we've had.
Yep.
We have, I think, look, I'm going to narrow it down and simplify it. We have two dominant relationships with the police. We have a leadership that halal wines and dines them with iftars and everything else. And for many who have been impacted at the pointy end of counter-violent extremism programs and heavy-handed policing, seeing the police have that type of relationship at one end of the community may be hurtful. There is an overlying sense of betrayal across the ummah that we don't have leaders that reflect maybe sentiments of many. And then there's, of course, the other relationship that we have with police that we kind of saw at City Hall and elsewhere, Liverpool 7. And if we go back a decade or two, at 800 cops ramming in doors, dawn raids, even the case of the young child with autism being framed and set up.
Yep.
So we have collective memory about the country's policing when we have been, and overall the relationship with the Muslim community is one of policing, whereas scrutinized and securitized community. So there's a lot going on there, a lot of emotions, and different people have different relationships with police and different expectations and different hopes and different avenues. And just to riff off a little bit of what Sister Hanan said, I can appreciate that many a person and many a Muslim watching this were horrified and saw, and the images were enraging, and that sense of safety was eroded. I didn't have that moral panic as much because I've been studying, reading, seeing. I've spoken to Muslims who have been ripped out of airports, and we've advocated. And so I don't have a commentary on who the cops are per se, but I do have a commentary on what the relationship between Muslims and cops are.
Is there a concern that we've been desensitized to the point where this is just
I think
behavior as
I think
normal?
possibly, and also a resignation. A lot of us are resigned to our disempowerment. Like there's not much we can do. But there are others who are, I don't know, I can't make commentary about wholesale sentiments in the community. I'll leave it up to everybody else to. But yeah, there's a lot of how could they, and calls for resignation of the New South Wales Commissioner. Now, look, I'm going to be blunt. When I heard that, I laughed. Right now, it could, I don't know, man. I was like, what?
Yeah.
When I heard for like the resignation of the Premier and stuff like that, I was like, why this incident?
Yeah.
And I'm also going to say something, and I'm going to admit, I'm running against the grain. I actually saw those images as an act of Muslim empowerment. Of course, it's enraging. Don't get me wrong. I can see the violence. I haven't erased that.
Yep.
But to see Sheikh Wassam and others stay in sujood, stay in their prayer, stay calm.
Yep.
For me, that was an image of our dignity, an act of our strength. Yeah. Or even to pray as an act of protest in that moment. Of course, there's time. It's Maghrib. I get it.
Yep.
So for me, I didn't have that more. Oh, how could the cops? I've been to many protests and I've seen plenty of heads kicked in. And maybe I'm desensitized,
Probably.
but yeah. But I don't like when I heard a lot of commentary, there were people who were shocked at the police's brutality. And also keep in mind, I'm a lecturer in Indigenous studies,
Yep.
and I don't have an image of the cops not being violent. Right. So I wasn't shook.
Yep.
Of course, still angry, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't like this is out of the norm. And when, forgive me, I'll pause here, when people are saying this is un-Australian, this doesn't belong in Australia, that for me also speaks to maybe a newness or naivety or something about the relationship between us and the state.
No, I get you.
And I think that you have the privilege of being an academic and very well read. For the majority of the Muslim community, they're continuously being confronted with acts of violence. And every time there's a little moment of reprieve, something else comes on. So there's an accumulation of anxiety, hyperactivity, and trauma, and do we feel safe? And it's not only the adults, it also goes towards the children. And we remember the optics of, Christchurch terrorist attack, where he went into the mosque in act of worship, which is Friday Jummah for us, and then we spent a few months thinking, is it safe for us to go to the masjid, in case someone wants to do or carry out a copycat kind of event. So the optics again, a few years later, where you've got New South Wales police who violently attacked worshippers, it's these kind of images imprint on our nervous system.
Of course, yeah.
And it feels the damaging of relationships with the Muslim community and the state. And I agree with you where there's two different camps. We do have leaders who will talk behind closed doors with police and never communicating that to the Muslim community. So everything is done with secrecy. Even the assumed apology that the New South Wales Commissioner said he made was done in secrecy with a few community leaders. Yeah. We all saw it visually, and I have to add that it wasn't only the Muslim community, as we know, that was verbally assaulted, pepper sprayed and chased and had vertebrae broken. It was the general Australian public. And whilst it might look like, that the Muslims were targeted, most of the protesters were not even Muslim. Yeah. These are peaceful Australians who came out to speak out against the genocide and against the invitation of a leader, or Israel, Isaac Herzog, who The UN even said, incited genocide. So if we can't even protest, someone who's inciting a genocide, something that is clearly at the most basic level, against humanity, what does it say about ourselves as as individuals, as a community, as a nation, as politicians? Because they're giving free rein to war criminals. They're holding umbrellas and protecting them in the rain. Even those optics, where they're protecting the president of Israel, who's subjugating Palestinians to a genocide, and then the state police has a heavy-handed response to the peaceful protesters who were protesting against a genocide. So you kind of think, make this make sense. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that was very powerful imagery. The dichotomy of those two photos, those two images were very powerful. But Hanan, on that point, you mentioned children. You mentioned that, like, as we grow up, we're taught to respect police, to reach out to police for support and help. What kind of impact is this having on the young generation, on children?
I think at this stage, when it comes to children, we have to remember that they have developing brains. So they're not going to internalize information like we do, where we try and get the facts, we form patterns, and there's nuance. Children don't have that at their disposal because of brain development. So they're going to internalize the imagery, and think, oh my God, I'm feeling unsafe. I'm going to be unsafe because I'm a Muslim and they're Muslim. They're going to see themselves within those who are praying Maghrib. So obviously they're going to feel a sense of unsafety. And we know with child's cognitive, social, behavioral development, that safety is an essential feature between a parent and child, and even when they're at school, community, or even society. So when children feel unsafe because their identity has been challenged as Muslims, and they will question their parents, do we feel unsafe? I remember my daughter, actually, after September 11, and, she was in high school, and I didn't realize until she came out of her room once and said, Mom, why do they hate Muslims? Why do they hate us so much? And that stunned me, and obviously I gave her age appropriate answers. And this is what we need to be doing. And we need to acknowledge what they saw. We can't invalidate what the children saw, but we let them know that sometimes, bad things do happen, but we need to connect their sense of safety. We need to let them know that they're safe with us, they're safe within our communities, and at the same time, we need to be able to, as a Muslim community, reaffirm our Islamic identity with children, and, not let them modify, their behavior because they're just worried if the police are going to come after them. I mean, how does that look, for example, when the optics are the police heavy-handedly handled Muslim worshippers? So if a Muslim, is stopped for breath testing, for example, or is in the community, they're going to have a startled or hypervigilant response where they feel unsafe in that community, because those images, they're not soft. They're actually quite entrenched, within us.
Look, without taking away from what you said, I think it's very important, especially considering your professional background, to speak about the impacts on children and others. And I may be only speaking for myself, so I'll just put that clause there.
Go for it.
Whenever we ever felt safe, I feel like this is a moment we're using to really drill home about the relationship of the policing, because it's so confronting. But I belong to a generation, I'm fairly confident speaking on their behalf, we've never felt safe. I think this image shows maybe what we've felt. I don't know. But
what you mean, as a Muslim, as a person?
Yeah, maybe it's me. Like, that's what I'm saying.
Adult?
Yeah, maybe it's me because, you're political to an extent. You're an activist of types. You speak about these things in a particular way. So maybe, but then we have to be careful here, because if what we're saying is that this event in and of itself fractured the relationship between police, government, and the community, then what was happening prior to it? Because my point is, it's an escalation, it's an accumulation, it's a logical outcome, and that safety was never quite there. We for 2 years, we flipped the script here. For 2 years, they've been calling the protests violent, right? For 2 years, but for 20 years, they've been calling Muslims violent, right? And it's not the first time that I've seen protesters and be confronted by police in that way. So maybe it is for some, but I would question. What I would suggest, because I can't speak on the behalf of anybody else. This is the clearest way to articulate the violence the state's doing towards Muslims, because it's right, it's confronting, it's in your face. But for me, that violence has always been there. It's always in the structure of types. It's always been, be careful, you know. What's that joke we keep saying about going to the airport, you know, flying Muslim or things like that? We're always worried about the borders, about crossing frontiers. Don't speak too loud. Don't be too political.
What's on your social media?
You know, we all joke that Asia is listening to our WhatsApp. So the police haven't just rocked up. They've been there for a while.
That's true.
But this is confronting many, and then it's hard to maybe make excuses for it. How do you make excuse for this? But also, because we're a spiritually anchored community, it's prayer. Right, it's our prayer. We're in, like, this is God consciousness. We're in our prayer. You know, we're not supposed to be distracted by anything. It's to be ripped out of prayer. So I think that scandalized this lack of safety far more. But yeah, not taken away from the act of children watching this who are grown up and seeing all this. But
I agree that that discussion needs to be had when, you know, there's, you know, children start to understand abstract thinking, you know, justice, you know, what is good, what is bad, you know, and love and hate in more broader terms. And like, I remember going to school, you know, I had the best English teacher, you know, the last 4 years. Shout out to, you know, Mr. Enzo from Bankstown Girls High. He taught us how to critically assess and analyze and make arguments. You know, that's what got me through university, right? So when I'm seeing today, you know, that things that don't make sense, like, you know, Chris Minns, Premier of New South Wales, and now Queensland Premier, he wants to beat New South Wales to criminalise chants, you know, and connect the pro-Palestinian human rights movement with Bondi. I'm like, how does 1 + 1? That 1 + 1 does not equal 2. There was no bearing on that relationship, but it's an additional state violence and just blaming of the Muslim community, whatever connection they wish to make. You know, the concept of even social cohesion doesn't mean anything anymore. It means what the power structures want it to mean.
It never meant anything.
Yeah, and we just have to, as minorities, and I do believe those in vulnerable communities who are targeted, you know, have to fit in within the parameters of what they set. You know, we can only protest and debate and dissent within those parameters. Anything outside of that is an act of violence, which needs to be contained. And if you don't, I know, you would know I'm Palestinian. Most people don't know I'm Palestinian. It's the story of my life, you know. But I've been chanting, you know, pro-Palestinian chants, you know, since childhood. You know, it's not new for us. So, and from the river to the sea, it's actually quite common. So when I hear the misrepresentation of what it means to suit the political sphere, it's disingenuous, and there's nothing we can do about it, because when lies are repeated about these chants, when it's repeated, it becomes like common sense, even though it's far removed from reality. Like, I remember in 2015, you all were around, and in the AFL Indigenous round where Adam Goods, you know, he was celebrating cultural pride by using an imaginary spear. Now, mainstream people looked at as an act of hostility and violence. He interpreted it as a visual imagery of cultural pride, you know. But because commentators kept making up their own conclusions, that became the reality, and it was subsequently booed, you know, for months on the field. It's the same thing with the Palestinian chants. You know, we know what it means, intifada, from the river to the sea, but it's deliberately mischaracterized, and our voices are not as strong as the powerful. And one more thing, like, even Chris Minns, he created a new chant that was never chanted, globalise the intifada. Like, I'm thinking, no one ever chanted that. You know, he created it and normalized it, where now a lot of politicians saying, we've got to stop globalise the intifada. No one was chanting it. You created it and you want to criminalise it. So, you know, Grace Tame had mentioned that chant during the protest last week. And, you know, people want her stripped of her Australia Day award. I mean, she is a dissenting Australian with such strong powers, you know, who survived, you know, child and sexual abuse. But the minute she goes outside the status quo, the parameters of social cohesion, which power instigated, you know, they want to go after her, you know. So we really don't have a lot of power, and I think that breeds a lot of collective anxiety on our part.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
Go for it, yeah.
Why are they doing this?
Mm.
Like, I feel like, did I anticipate?
I know, yeah,
Yeah, pretty much.
We know because
This
Yeah.
was the
we know
next
it.
question.
Yeah.
We've been
Yeah.
experiencing this since September 11. So there's a lot of surveillance and national security laws, and the prism of national security is always looking at the Muslim as suspect. And minorities, and it didn't happen with us, as you know. It happened, hundreds of years ago with the First Nations and Torres Strait Islander communities. And they've been trying to channel within the appropriate systems, even when they do so within the appropriate systems of law and engagement, they still don't have laws in their favour. But since October 7, one community, has been prioritised, where you've got an AFP task force, you've got new laws, you've got significant funding, so we can see the imbalance, as well in who gets supported and who doesn't.
I think what's more frustrating is this constant dialogue of social cohesion. It's all words, but then the actions and the hate speech and everything that follows is complete opposite. It kind of doing everything in their power to almost destroy social cohesion, especially from the Islamic perspective. So I guess back to your question, why? Like what?
Okay, so I'm gonna push back a little bit. What was it? Freud's famous. Sorry to bring up Freud, but we're all psychologists, right?
Who's Freud?
Example of displacement. Like your boss is bullying you, is harassing you. You can't really talk back because you might lose your job. So you go home and you take it out on your wife or your or your son or something like that. You displace your frustration and anger from a threatening target to a less threatening target. So I want to use this as an example to say something. I think Muslims' frustrations is also community frustration is a displacement. I've noticed that we go around, and I'm not talking just about this conversation. Generally, we go around over and over again, highlighting the hypocrisy, highlighting the contradictions, highlighting the double standards, highlighting how they treat us differently and all the rest. And I think there's a bit of a displacement here. Our anger is being displaced on the details of these contradictions, but we have to confront the more threatening truth. And the more threatening truth is Australia isn't built to represent the interests of Palestine and us. There's an allegiance, a civilizational allegiance with Israel, like there is with America. And that allegiance is deeply embedded into the structure of the way the global North and the Western civilization put itself together. There's no point comparing ourselves if we don't bring in that civilization. And racism has a function to defend a particular political order. It's a form of dispossession of the land we're on, dispossession of the land in Palestine, dispossession of our voices, our rights, and a form of governance and control. So unless we address the reason why we're displacing the argument continually to the symptoms, hey, they're not treating us the same way, but they haven't been treating us the same way for a very, very long time. And we keep cycling it, and I feel like we're displacing our anger onto when Hanan says, make it make sense, right? And that displacement, that anger is like, why is a country that most all purposes is a decent country, but politically, right? How can it betray and contradicts these pillars that it said it established? International law, human rights, democracy, all of it gets suspended. Let's bring in I was never a fan of social cohesion. Let's bring it in as one of their values. Multiculturalism, all of it gets suspended. All of it gets pushed aside. Why? Because all of these may be important, but they are never too important to undermine civilizational anxiety about who they are. And fundamentally, as it stands, in their eyes, the Muslim is a greater threat than the Zionist.
So where does moral injury come into this? Can that be relevant here? Can this be related into this?
For moral injury for us?
Yeah, as a community, I guess,
Yeah. Do you want to have a shot at that?
Yeah, so I think moral injury happens when someone feels something deeply unfair or unjust has happened to them, and something unfair has taken place, especially in a way that violates our core values, and we talked about, for example, the prayer incident, but even in the sense of our identity, like today, Pauline Hanson, she was under fire for saying last night, I think at Sky News, that, there are no good Muslims. It's like it's perpetual. With Pauline Hanson, like a few years ago, she said Islam is a disease. So we kind of feel that there should be justice, dignity, and truth. And so when that's betrayed, it creates that moral injury, and we kind of, like, what have we done wrong?
Yeah.
But like Yasser said, this system is designed, to continuously put us under the spotlight, because you need a boogeyman. You need a scapegoat.
Yeah.
And we're not a very influential community. We don't have strong lobbies, so we're kind of easy targets, and we don't even have the resources, on the one hand, to engage the structures to our community advantage, just to live like everybody else, and we don't even have the resources to alleviate the distress of our community, So in the middle, we're in a bit of a bind, and we feel as if our dignity continuously is under attack, So we kind of be thinking this isn't fair, but life wasn't fair, and so we anchor in our spiritual tradition. That's what we have to fall back on. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran that, life in this dunya is a test. We're going to experience hardships. He'll test us with, poverty and difficulties. I mean, that's a given, and so we know that it's our response that it's going to be measured. So we need to make effort, to try and make our situations better, but our responsibility is to also be patient. And when it comes to sabr and patience, it's not passive, because Islam is not a passive religion. It's a very active religion. So sabr is the same. So within our pathway of difficulty, and our the journeys of hardship, we need to actively try and change the nature of our condition. And I think that the visibility from our community perspective counts. We don't have a lot of visible community leaders, who are championing our cause. Like, everyone needs a hero. We kind of don't have, that hero within our community. And it's, something where we feel as if, all of this, being subjugated to all of this, can lead to a lot of anger and shame and disillusionment. And by the way, as you would know, and I know you would agree, it's okay to feel angry. We shouldn't be thinking, we should subdue our anger, because when we feel anger, and it's a natural human emotion Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us, that's going to help us then, seek measures towards justice or trying to rectify our decision. So it's a vehicle, that emotion is a vehicle to try and prevent that invalidation that we continuously feel from powerful structures, So, and in terms of identity, belonging, and safety, I feel as if, and it might come across, how am I going to word this? I feel as if we have to become Bob Katter, because he strongly invalidates his Lebanese heritage, So I feel as if we have to strongly invalidate who we are as Muslims, or pro-Palestinian or whatnot, or Palestinian, So they, and we know in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said they'll not be happy until we become one of them. So we need to be able to, as a community, come together and support one another, so that we, at least within our community space, build that community capacity. We're not expecting the government, or the police or the laws and so forth at this point to protect us, and when we can see it measured against us. I mean, they're trying to, it was openly said, that they want to ban Hizb ut-Tahrir. They haven't committed a crime, but they want to ban them anyway. So the bar and the net keeps widening for our community. So I'm pretty much at a loss of what do we do. So politically speaking,
Okay, I'm going to start speaking in the way that got me in trouble, and the reason why a lot of people dislike me in this community. I'm loved as well, just to be clear.
This is the best place to do
Yeah, okay. It's the most symbolic place.
Yeah.
Moral injury, and a lot of what Hanan does, I'm sorry, I have to say it's the only truth I know, and I ain't okay about anger. Ain't no one. Like, first of all, I don't care about Pauline Hanson. I don't even understand why anyone does.
Why is she relevant? I don't
right?
know. Yeah,
like, I don't care. Like,
I
guy,
get
she.
it,
But ain't no one police my anger more than the Muslim community. Ain't no one morally injured me more than my own leadership. And unless we have that difficult conversation about how we have been fundamental, look, Israel is Israel, Australia is Australia, we're Australians, we're here, and the reality is the world is the way the world is. We inherited a particular order. It is what it is.
Sure.
And ultimately, when you speak about our position as Muslims and sabr and tawakkul Allah, okay, and then we have to ask a question, okay, what is, because I've asked a question, I've said like Gaza is a question that confronts us of who we are, generally, broadly, the whole country, but maybe also as Muslims, like, who are you, right? And honestly, like, I'm sorry, I can't hide this. And like, I appreciate that it comes across as me punching down, but I'm not. I'm actually punching up. I'm punching to what I call the managers of the government that have been that our community leadership. Before, okay, so I've been a critic of Hizb ut-Tahrir, but my criticism of Hizb ut-Tahrir was an intellectual one, and it was built on generosity, spending time with these guys. Prior to that, we had a bunch of Muslims selling Hizb ut-Tahrir out. We had a bunch of Muslims selling the bad Muslim out. We had a bunch of Muslims coming out and say, they're the threat, they're the threat.
Yeah.
You know, they're the bad Muslim. You know, I'm the good Muslim. I love Australia. They established this narrative of good v bad all the time in order to gain supposed favor from a community because they misinterpreted and misread racism. And then what we do is displace all of that onto the broader Australian society and the broader Australian structures of government. Government's got one job, man. That one job is to protect the interests of Australia. And when those interests align with Israel, and they have because they align with America, they're not gonna make a moral argument for the equality of Muslims.
But how's it seeing thousands and thousands of people on the street not aligned with the interests of Australia? Like, these are the Australian people.
Because I think we've fundamentally misunderstood how states are put together, right? They're not representations of people's sentiments. Yeah. They're economic blocks. They're security blocks, right? So Australia needs America for China, for all the rest. You know, there's various different geopolitical. Without going too deeply into it, it's not going to make it this. The regime is not a moral one. It's not an ethical. It's an economic military bloc. So therefore, its main interest is its own economic prosperity and survival. If it was about the better argument, the moral argument, the truth, Palestine would have won 70 years ago.
True.
Right? So they have to like now. That leaves us. Go back to the moral injury. What about us? Why are we continuing to perpetuate myths about this country? Like, doesn't mean you have to hate Australia. I don't hate Australia.
No,
like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless me in this. But I want to speak about what it is. And so to go to Hanan's point, like, of course, Australia has a function, has a logic, it's trying to do sort of thing. But let's go back a step. All I have and all we have in control of is ourselves. The best politics is the one that we can self-determine ourselves. And I think, I'll say it again without being overly provocative. Sorry, our leadership has let us down. It has perpetually let us down. We did interfaith dialogue on some silly assumption that contact theory would gain us, would make racism crumble. You're talking about boycotting the police and politicians now. This call has been, why are you acting like this is the first crime? There was Iraq, there was Afghanistan, there was the detention centers. Right. We have never boycotted. We have always welcomed them after an act of violence. And then the accumulation comes to 2026 where they do nothing about a genocide. And all of a sudden, we're shocked. What are you shocked about? Like, we have perpetuated this moderate assimilative politics because we haven't stood up for ourselves, because ultimately, and this is where I give grace, because we're governed by racism. We're scared. Right now, leadership, if you're in leadership, right, and we are Muslims, as you say, spiritually song, fear Allah. You lose, man. If you're going to take up that position of leadership, there's haqq, that's it. You lose. And I just feel like all of this anxiety around the way the state is treating us, excuses about the way our own leadership treated us. And I can't say this out loud because I become the bad guy, but there has to be difficult conversations about our own community structures, right? And I'll pause on this, okay? I bracket everything as a fight against Islamophobia because my definition of Islamophobia is broad.
That's right.
And where do we get our funding to fight Islamophobia from? Yeah. Well, I mean, it's insanity, bro, right? And that in and of itself tells you something. So you can whistle out a whole song of sirens about how the Emiratis have sold out, how the Saudis have sold out, how Egypt have sold out. And but you're getting paid too, man. Yeah? Like, so at the end of the day, I ask myself, okay, they are what they are. Gaza's asking me, who am I? Right? And I think we have to have that conversation.
Can I just add on Yasser's point, and he'll be surprised to know that I agree with him, even though I agree with him a lot. When he's talking about, the difference between individual politics and then state politics, and Australia is militarily, economically aligned, with Israel, US, and so forth. I mean, the classic example of that is, I was astonished. I remembered about 2 years ago when the genocide was happening that, there was this parliamentary Friends of Palestine. So I was Googling, And then I remember my jaw dropped because the co-founder of the parliamentary Friends of Palestine was none other than, Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister. I'm like, how did you go from starting up this movement to this? And that's a classic example, because once you're part of the system, the larger system, you can't turn your back away from that. And in line with our community politics, it's true. I've been saying a lot of the times on social media that our community does double speak. It'll chest beat, in front of us, Qala Allah, Qala Rasul, we must do this, we must do that, but then behind closed doors with politicians, they have all these other different kind of discussions, and we've seen this clearly. And, for example, if we can use the example of the courageous, strong Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah, she comes under scrutiny, by powerful pro-Israel, pro-Zionist lobby groups, and the Adelaide Festival wasn't the first incident. It's been ongoing for years where she's concerned. If we take last year, for example, we had powerful pro-Israeli lobby groups pressure, Jason Clare, for example, to investigate her research, and she was put under, investigation for 11 months, and our community said nothing. The community who gets the funding, we know who they are, the community leaders who get government funding. I always wondered why that was the case. And even when she was found to be free of any error, she was, exonerated from any wrongdoing, nothing still came from our leadership. But when the Adelaide Festival controversy came out, those leaders who get funding from the government spoke out, because they have no affiliation with the South Australian Premier and government, so then we know, okay, them speaking out is conditional on funding. We need to have a system within our community where those who speak for us are not tied to government funding, because then we can see, what is spoken and what is left unspoken. I remember you were saying something in one of the chat groups that we need, and I do agree with this, we need to have funded activists in our community, who have strong legal teams behind them to support them. This is exactly what we need. So the community can do what it needs to do, and then we have the activists actively, having press conferences, engaging where it needs to be, being visible.
Wasn't it like Palestine Action Group?
Yeah. And Palestine Action Group, I have to give them so much credit, not because I'm Palestinian, but if we go down to the most basic human level, they are fighting, not fighting, they are trying, they are fighting for human rights.
That's right.
The most basic, of all requests is stop the genocide, ceasefire, stop, selling military equipment, not non-lethal military equipment, to Israel, and when they start to criminalise what human rights is trying to do, then we're really in a police state, and that is, it's and it should come as not surprising, because we've been seeing this all along as well.
So, look, it can be argued that there is some defeatist kind of perspective or realistic perspective, however you want to look at it. So what practical strategies, like what can people, I guess, that are listening today, I guess what practical strategies can people take away to kind of manage the feelings of overwhelm, the feelings of unsettled, and the concerns that the past week has driven into the consciousness?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, you go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Me answering practical strategies. Yeah.
Sorry to say defeatist, by the way.
No.
Like it's, but it can be perceived that way or realistic in that sense. But.
Can I address that? Because I think it's an important point. That criticism is often said out loud, and I think it's a defense of the state. There's some type of compulsion. Like, I understand as Muslims we are asked to be positive, asked to have faith.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't want to turn this into a spectrum of skepticism v optimism and all the rest, or hope v non-hope.
Yep.
It's more a case of analysis,
Fair enough.
and non-analysis. Yeah. But ideologically, the state is defended by a kind of like subcontracting you to have more hope in your own solutions than like the damage, the violence is done in this context.
Yep.
What are you going to do about it? Right. And then if you don't come up with an answer against this existing structure, you are deemed therefore a problem. Stick in the mud. You're just negative. Da 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 da. This has been around for a long, long time as a defense. The first thing, and then now let me go into the practical strategies.
Please.
Look, I dabble a bit in narrative therapy and so forth. One of the things is we have to be, if you're politically literate and educated about something and you have a narrative about the reason the way the world is, it can work as a defense for you. Yeah, anxiety can peak and go up in different ways when you feel completely unstable and uncertain about the way the world is run and so forth. So one of the ways that helped me protect myself, and this is at a psychological level, is trying to understand the world. Doesn't mean trying to. Now this is different from trying to make the world a pretty place. It's trying to understand the world, right? Yeah. It's not trying to say I will win. It's trying to understand the world and have a solid footing on that world. That's one thing on a psychological, at a collective level. I've said it before and again and forever, and I'll repeat it one more time. No community will survive by asking for permission to survive. We survive through growth and prosperity, and the way to do that is through self-determination as a paradigm. Now, as a general principle, what self-determination means, we need to build our own institutions. We need the Muslim dollar to be spent around in the Muslim community first, right? We need to establish our activists. We need to have a legal net for them. We need to be able, like if somebody loses their job for activism, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide, and inshallah He provides through the community. That people will be there for you. Yeah. I was at some Islamophobia thingamajiggy, blah blah, X, Y, and Z, trying to prevent it, whatnot. And there was a case study, and the case study was like Sister Aisha has opened up a chicken shop or something like that, right? Yeah, and then all the right-wing racists come along and they'll give her 1 star. What do you do? And this was when a round table, what would you do for Sister Aisha? And it was like, all right, we'll call the local councillor, this and that, we'll call the police and so forth. Now keep this mindset. This mindset is like every solution must go through the state. The answer is this: if Sister Aisha, we get the community, we go get catering from her, we take our family there, we support those businesses for her. We put 5 stars for. Remember that TikTok trend of that in America? Yeah, there were the powdered milk one, right? The baby milk.
I don't know.
No, everybody don't watches TikTok.
No, TikTok. I know the one.
Generation, bro.
That were encouraging.
Really help me out, bro. You know, like there was an experiment. This non-Muslim woman called up all the churches.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
And then she called the mosque, and and the next thing you know, they had all these 5 stars, and Google put it down and so forth.
Right.
There's another example. Like if you support your community in such a way, you can lift them, right? And yes. That for me is ultimately the solution. Start mind shifting. I don't need the cops. I don't. Of course, we are tax-paying citizens. Yeah. There are going to be times where we need police. Our taxes should return to us. Yeah? Don't get me wrong. It's not a totalitarian either or. But when it comes to political advocacy, mobilization, this is your duty. It's not the taxpayer's duty. It's your duty, right? And so self-determination for me means establishing and promoting Muslim businesses. And I'll say this, it is an absolute tragedy that we don't have to going into the 3rd decade since September 11, we have not propped up, promoted, sponsored scholarships in political sciences, humanities to help support our leadership. Why do they not have an army of consultants? Right? Who lived Muslims, like you can hire a consultant, but people have grown up in the community. Why are there none? Seriously,
it's
genuinely.
a very good question. No, that's definitely.
If you're the practical solution is a mind shift. Yeah, rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pray that reliance comes through your own community to establish, because what the government will always do is look for the interests of the government.
So how do you challenge the people that constantly say, well, this is not going to do anything? Going to protest is not going to do anything. You know, just spending my money in banks down and Punchbowl's not going to do anything.
Okay.
Like that
All right, so
mentality, that defeatist.
there's plenty of debates that we get into. I make a general. This is me myself. No one has to follow this. I don't typically debate anybody who I believe it's not going to go anywhere unless there's an audience watching, right? And the reason why
Fair
is
point.
we try to lift the discourse around that person
right,
as
yeah.
opposed to just that person.
Yep.
There's certain people that they're not going to change, not just because even if you win the intellectual argument.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, they can't. They won't because there's so much interest in their position. Like, there's no point going to certain leaders and saying X, Y, and Z and have all the evidence in the world because X, Y, and Z equals give the money back.
That's right.
Right. And so when you're up against that, there's no point. You have to therefore create raise the sea level, create a discourse around them where other people may replace them. Like, have a kind of, forgive me for saying this, a market economy. Let the best argument manifest into new businesses. If you can't replace leaders directly, or not leaders per se, or bad policies directly, build new ones. Let the community be a contest. Because at the moment, I'm going to be hated. I'm going to be disliked. I'm not invited to any of the iftars. We should not be having 25-year leaders, 25-year veteran leaders who have been in the same position of influence and who have got it wrong so many times. In any other field or industry,
That's right.
they would not have survived.
Yeah.
But somehow do you know why they're surviving? Because our sentiment, our criteria, and our victories is not the criteria that keeps them there. The criteria that keeps them there is obedience to government. So if we cop L after L after L after L, they still survive. Because they're not there for our L's or our W's. They're there because they're the go-to person between upstairs and us, right? So as long as that's the status quo, we will continue to cop L's.
What's L's?
Losses.
Oh, okay.
Losses
You should know that. You're a doggy
Well,
supporter.
let's hope for this new generation.
Okay.
Can
Can I just add
Yeah,
to that? I do agree. You know, we need to be informed. But one of the things I keep telling our community, you know, especially since October 7, is that in order for us to be productive, our mental health is being affected because of what's happening around us. But one of the things I find that is not helpful is a continuing viewing of all the traumatic images, you know, that's coming out of Palestine or Rohingya or other parts of the world, you know, people being oppressed and, you know, they feel, you're talking about defeatist, they actually feel a defeatist. And they don't realize that, you know, it impacts the nervous system where they can't function anymore. Like, you can no longer be productive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be productive. You know, he's not saying don't feel. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created emotions. Emotions is natural. It's actually a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, so we need to be able to protect our mental well-being, you know, whilst taking actions to better our situation. And in talking about well-being and the state, I did say on my social media, and I will say it very loudly, you know, in New South Wales, you know, there's victims of crime, you know, where if you're a primary or secondary victim of a crime, you can seek free counselling, which is funded by the taxpayer, you know, and we know therapy is actually quite expensive. You know, so there are opportunities to get your mental health resorted, you know, or sorted out, or go to your GP, go to see someone, go to a trusted person. And it's not always therapy that you need. It could be a good neighbour. It could be the stronghold of the community. Ramadan is coming up. It's when we get together, we do tarawih, you know, and we feel a sense of community. Because when we feel a sense of community and we're quite strong, that's a buffer to mental health issues, you know, as well. So, and we need to do everything, obviously, with ikhlas, in sincerity and intention. And if we and we need to do the typical things that we do, understand, give charity, you know, be informed, you know, engage politicians when it's necessary, and disengage. At the moment, we've got a community call to disengage with police, you know, and disengage with politicians, you know, and we can't be half-hearted about it. We're either all in or all out, you know, and when we've got, you know, very strong religious leaders who say disengage. And it's not a new phenomenon. I said to yesterday, the other day, that, disengagement, it's looking like it's a new phenomenon. I remember him saying this over 10 years ago, and we just haven't been able to align, ourselves with a consistent set of politics, and I think that really disadvantages us, because everybody's politics is very important and everyone understands what needs to be done differently. The mistake that we make is that we put all our political trust in religious leaders, and the mistake that they make is assume that leadership, at the same time. We've got an imams board, who are funded significantly to assist a state police with countering violent extremism. That's unheard of. I'm going to say it doesn't make sense. We can say that the state doesn't make sense, but then our community leaders don't make sense. They are part and parcel.
No, the state makes sense.
Yeah.
Like what Australia's doing makes sense.
Yes, I'm saying our leaders. It doesn't make sense, because they are supposed to be protecting our community, and it's worse when they're funded to prevent Islamophobia, and then they're heavily engaged in the Islamophobic systemic structures that are subjugating us. And the government is playing the arsonists and the firefighters.
Hanan, they're not funded to protect Muslims; they're funded to protect non-Muslims. Our own leaders are funded to help broader Australia deal with what I think is mostly fictional Muslim violence, right? There's a broader thing I don't want to get too into, because I know we've gone into mental health, but look, let me draw a scenario. You spent a significant amount of decades, 6, 7 plus, and go 100, but especially since September 11, of Muslim majority countries receiving significant amount of violence through wars, displacement. I read a quote, something like, since 2001, the Afghan war, all the way up until the global war on terror, there's been something like 4.5 million innocent Muslims killed as a consequence of these wars, 30 odd million displaced, if you include Syria, right? We've had every major country. We've had at least in the Arab world, the repression of the Arab Spring, and all, right? There is significant amount of Muslim trauma, pain, and anger that has come as a result of those wars. Now you have to deal with that anger, and that anger typically gets coded in the Muslim male body, coded in the Islamist, coded in the quote unquote hyper religious, because the fantasy is the sources of violence is religion. And so you have all of these, like, you do the wars over there, but we have to maintain peace here, or not so much peace, non-violence here. And then we employ the Muslims here to control the excesses of the war on terror. Because if you grow up watching, sorry, forgive me for saying Allah yarhamhum, and I understand, dead Afghanis, dead Iraqis, dead Palestinians, you see displaced Syrians. Like, name me a time in your adult life you haven't watched and seen dead Muslim children. In a time, I cannot remember a year, right? So when all of that, you're like, as you said, your nervous system is absorbing that, and you're getting all of that on top of all of that through the industry of Islamophobia. Go back to where you come from. They insult the Prophet, peace be and blessings upon him. They talk about our religion being backwards. We're misogynistic. All of these are, at the end of the day, it's a powder keg. So therefore, in order to, they're not trying to protect us. They're trying to protect our the mainstream society from our explosion. You do not do wars like this and expect no blowback, right? So CVE wasn't even about, like, and then we get people come out there and say ISIS is X, Y, and Z evil. Of course, ISIS, like, whatever, man. Like, I don't even know why we're talking about it. Like, if you want to talk about ISIS, talk about the Iraq War. Right? Like, I'm not even saying like ISIS, don't like. It's a stupid conversation. Of course. Talk, right? So just on this point about what this is why I call them managers. They're managing us.
That's an interesting way.
They're not leading us. They're managing us. And fine, for the greater. Now, Australia makes sense why they would do that. From a realist perspective, it makes sense. My leaders don't make sense. Like, I'm asking you, and what do we get in exchange for it? Then they'll say the strangest things, like, we're allowed to pray. They're going to fund our mosques. Like, okay, I'll pause there because, my nervous system is getting flared up as well.
Fair point. But look, on that point, look, look, I will address this to you, Hanan. How do you have this conversation? How do families have this conversation with children? How do they help reduce their children's anxieties and stresses based on the context and everything that's happening in the world?
Well, specifically children, I mentioned at the beginning, because they don't process cognitively information. like we do, and they internalize images. They don't understand all these big concepts, until they reach, age 12 and to 14 and start to understand, very difficult concepts and, make sense of them. So again, I go to the important thing of establishing safety for children, because you want them to develop, in a healthy way, but you don't want them to also develop in a state of oblivion, to shelter them from the real world. Because we have in our scriptures, in our hadith and Quran, where there's been difficulties, hardships, wars, and all these other events, and that are consistently, also happening today. So you can make those connections. At the time of the Prophet, he did this. He stood up for justice. He advocated for the Muslims and so forth. But you need to be able to do that in an age-appropriate way. Bad things happen. You can't also shield the children from the reality of bad things happening.
Of course.
But what you need to be able to do is establish that safety and connection and attunement. But and not invalidate their concerns, and also not say, oh my God, they hate us as Muslims, because their threat response is going to be activated.
Absolutely.
You don't want to heighten that threat response, because you might not think that they're going to go to their room and internalize it. They'll have nightmares. So one of your comments could have now led a spiral into them thinking the world is unsafe. And then they become hypervigilant, they become traumatized at a young age. That shapes their neural circuitry, and that could also most probably will prevent, healthy psychological development. So it's about a balance, and that's why I do believe we don't have the kind of the skills, even as parents, to be able to teach our children in an age-appropriate manner. We talk to them like they're little adults, but they can't process that way, So, just tell them stories of the Prophet and get them to try and internalize that, in an age-appropriate way. And obviously, as they become teenagers, you can be more nuanced in what is happening. I mean, we have to be more nuanced with our community leaders and community members anyway. And even then, it's very difficult. So it's a spiritual jihad, everyone. It's a spiritual jihad that we have in our community. To be able to do this. It's not going to be easy, but we were never promised ease. We also need to do, and from what I get from what you've been saying, is radical acceptance. We know this in psychology, right?
Yes.
We need to radically accept it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be easy for us, but it's what we do, within the time that we are here, what we do individually, what we do collectively, that is going to count as frequent flyer Jannah points. I'm not seeking Australian values points, whatever they mean. We need to be ensuring that our children are guided and influenced and encouraged, to instill Islamic justice values and peace. And I mean, at the end of the day, we are trying to uphold what Islam understands as peace, and, so that, the audience doesn't get us wrong. Peace is about submission, but we also need to seek and try and reverse, systems of injustice to the best way possible. And if we don't succeed, we still win, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to make the effort. The end result shouldn't be, the injustice is gone. That's not our end game. Our end game is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's reaching Jannah. It's facing Him, with a clean heart, a sound heart, knowing that we did the best within the limited resources that we do have. The Prophet experienced poverty, war, injustice, and so forth. What makes us special? So khair, inshallah.
I'm glad you raised that. It's a very good point, because it sounds like, look, a lot of conversations with families, with parents, is that they struggle a lot to be parents, especially in this climate with the social media, the content, the imagery, like you were saying yesterday, like it's the constant bombardment of images for the past decade. It's just been constant. And how do we, as a society, as people, as humans, how do we prevent being re-traumatized through this whole content, the media, everything that we're seeing?
To broaden it beyond the Muslim community, like
as a society,
as a society in general, look, I really appreciate the points about parenting and protecting our children. Of course, it's an amana and an obligation and duty, and my dua goes to every parent that has to deal with some of these struggles. Like, But some of us ourselves are not fully healed ourselves, right? Some of us ourselves don't fully feel protected, and some of us don't have the mental health literacy or the or the ability to support, and we're juggling jobs, health issues, financial issues, on top of political issues, right? So we're burdened with all sorts of things, and life, being an academic for a long time, it was a bit less of an issue. I had different precarity around that job, but then when I started working as a full-time psychologist, just going to work the same day in, day out, carrying all of these burdens, these heavies, these, upper at the back, worried about these, like all these things, beyond being Muslim, like just this society is like you work to the bone, man. Your feet sick, then you're supposed to go home and keep an eye on your kids, and then the iPad starts parenting them. Our diets aren't all healthy. There's overly sugar. It's the system's meant for consumption, production, consumption, and we're trying to break that, short circuit it with a spiritual leaning, and then it becomes time and so forth. So there's so many, and then on top, as Muslims, we have to deal with the war on terror and Islamophobia and all the rest, right? And then we have to find and not only do we have to deal with it, we have to fight it. And so, subhanallah, I mean, yes, it's a test. And I've said this before to a group of friends, Islamophobia, and I say it won't sound right. Bear with me. I won't go too far into it. Hit me up if you want an explanation. But Islamophobia on one level, as a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is good to us. It demands, of course it's violent. Of course it kills. Of course it hurts. I'm not excluding that. But from a spiritual point of view, this test demands growth. And that growth, may bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may bring you closer to being just. Because especially if you're living in the first world, if there was if we didn't confront this, would we forget what injustice is because we consume and so forth? So Allahu Alam, I don't want, but just to answer your question, sometimes I see clients who are presenting problems and they're on different types of anxieties and so forth, and I say this often, I wonder if anxiety is just your fitra screaming out that some of this isn't meant to, your nervous system, I'm not meant to live like this. I'm not meant to be like this. I'm not meant to have this much stimulation. All right. I'm not meant to have this limited amount of time. We're always scarce on time. Haven't got enough time to work. Haven't got enough time to sleep. Right. Sometimes you wonder, if anxiety is actually, that signal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted an alarm system saying, return to your Lord, wind down. Allah, I'm not, please, I'm not giving advice about what anxiety is, right? Because different people present different ways. But the systems, and one thing, I'm not having to go at this, wallahi. I promise I'm not. When we talk about Islamic psychology, okay, fine, khair, I get it, and all the rest, especially when it speaks about the description of the nafs and so forth. But I'm always asking myself about Islamic psychology. How does Islamic psychology diagnose? And what does Islam have to say about this society that creates certain social mental illnesses? And one of them is it's bereft of any spiritual growth. Right? So what does Islamic society, I get where Islamic psychology may provide solutions to existing, but what does Islamic say about your fitra is being drowned? Right? So, and then all of this for me is not just a Muslim problem. Here is where Muslims, through the gift of Islam, can be a benefit to broader society. But we can't at the moment because we're barely surviving as not terrorists. Right? We're barely beyond that line.
Can I just interject there? What you said about Islamic psychology and how you think it should be framed is how it is, because the basis of Islamic psychology, is it's a discipline that integrates all the psychological sciences, but within that foundational knowledge of our spirituality, of our fitra. It's at the center. And we know in our deen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, He created us in a state of anxiety. And so our job in this dunya is to try and navigate this world, and subdue that anxiety so that we in the end, meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sound heart, without that anxiety. So we don't have that oscillation of our heart, which is anxiety in the physical heart and also spiritual heart. So, and we know that, in terms of fitra, our natural inclination, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us, we have the natural inclination towards goodness. In Islamic psychology, human nature is positively good. So we are supposed to, when we're feeling trauma or anxiety, or depression or despair, and actually Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He demands of us not to feel hopeless and not to feel despair, not to feel despondent. We're supposed to be hopeful, not hopeful of the dunya, but hopeful of the hereafter. But we need to journey in this dunya, to get there. It's like delayed rewards. We learned in psychology, Psychology 101, the benefits of delayed rewards when they did those experiments with the little children where they gave them a sweet, if they would wait, they will get more, and then they found longitudinal in the research that those who waited for the larger sweets or for more amount of sweets actually did better. They functioned better. So we have that where, where we know, all our efforts accumulate at the end, to meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end. So turning this anxiety into service, whether it's volunteering, whether it's in acts of worship. In fact, salah should be first. Establish your salah, establish your prayer. Yeah. But I'm mindful that, young people who are at no fault of their own, who are so consumed with social media, because that's how society is run. That's how algorithms are run. They have more influence over our children than parents and community leaders do. Okay, they will defend Muslims and Islam because of their identity, but they're moving away spiritually. Because there isn't that connection. I talk about connection and safety all the time.
Yes.
Where is that connection between community and the younger Muslims who feel despondent, feel detached, but based on principle, they're holding on to their identity. How can you say this about Muslims? So we also need to reach out to them because they're the next leaders. I remember when we were growing up, we thought, we're going to get it right. Our parents came, they're doing things the old-fashioned way, and we're going to get it right when we become, community leaders. But we're making the same mistakes, but in a more sophisticated way. Yeah. You know what I mean? And we haven't really channeled in young people's views, what their concerns are. And they may have a lot of solutions for our community, but because they're left out of the conversation because we're not in their space, they're in a different space. So how do we capture the space of the young people and give them hope, and give them things to do? They have a lot of energy. They do. So we're growing older, not that we don't have energy, but we also need to show leadership for the younger generation as well,
what's really interesting is that these attending the protests over the past, since the beginning of the genocide, seeing how organized they are, seeing how there's a young group of Muslims getting together, banding together, the student protests outside Sydney Uni, like the amount of energy that the young Muslim generation has seems to be there. It's just like, the concern is it channeled in the right place? Is it going in the right places? So what message would you give, would you both give to this generation in relation?
Well, look, mashallah, you're absolutely right. I've seen incredible acts of
solidarity. Yeah, they've been amazing.
I do think it's worthwhile mentioning that we owe the non-Muslim community, those especially on the left-leaning side of politics, who do a lot of the organising, especially when we consider the time in which the latest phase of the genocide post-October the 7 escalated in the type of violence we saw. A lot of Muslims had framed the left and the radical left and all the rest as enemies to the haqq and so forth. And, thankfully that assessment has matured a little bit. We can understand different aspects of the left. But yeah, so absolutely we've seen incredible acts of, I've been at the encampments at universities. I've seen young Muslims, put aside many of their careers and aspirations to fight for Palestine. I've seen their wounds out loud and, so yeah, they have. But I also think a nod is needed to the non-Muslim side of it. Like, I think if this was just purely a Muslim movement, it would have been crushed a long time ago, right? And that's not taking away any of the
but it's realistic.
I think in addition to what you said, Ayasar, and Haitham, you commending the university students movement, what I found that they also appreciated was what they were, using their energy, and channeling their sense of justice. But I found that they loved the support they were getting from the non-Muslim community and other political groups. But I noticed that the Muslims who went in really hard, they felt seen when our community leaders went there. also and supported them. Because they're like the young generation who need that leg up.
They do.
So our leaders can't be playing, politics with governments. They need to be there on the ground with young people, and they felt heard, because they know they can fight, and they can try and address the injustices, but when they've got the support of community leaders, that builds community as well. And these community leaders took risks as well. They took significant risks, and I think that's important. Again, we have to think of coming together as a sense of community, not one group's working in isolation, but supporting one another.
Yeah, look, sure, I absolutely been seen, and as you know, both of you, that it's a vital aspect of validation and support is core to our well-being. It's dignifying, so I don't want to undermine that point. But there's a flip side as well. I also think the opposite has happened. I think a lot of us and a lot of young Muslims don't care about leadership anymore. I've got mates from 10, 15 years ago that were very active in the community. They want nothing to do with the community anymore, right? And they're just tired of, right? And so I think maybe Allahu Alam, I don't want to make sweeping, totalizing claims. But we have to be very careful that we don't lose the vitality of this youth. They will go where justice is. They won't go where those who are diddly-daddling about it. They will go where they feel seen and validated and where the truth rings true, right? And so we may not see the consequences of these engagements with Premier Minz and Jason Clare 24 hours later, right? You may not see that. You may see what we call a null hypothesis. You don't know how many people you've lost.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think a lot of youth are like, if they're not going to be there, we don't need them. And we'll see where that goes. But alhamdulillah, they will turn into also what we mean by leader is anybody who's willing, it's not just about representation. It's anybody who's willing to take.
That's right.
Take up.
Like we've seen the development of the Muslim vote, like that process. I think that was a result of, I guess, the lack of leadership that the community was seeing. And look, I'm very mindful of time. I know we only have about 5-ish minutes left, and I'm not sure if we're going to leave room for Q&A. But I just want to leave you. I want to just open it up for a closing or reflection. Any perspectives, any views? If we are looking back at this moment in 6 months from now, what would you hope we had done well as a community?
Honestly, I feel as if that is a very hard question, because as a community, we are very reactionary. Even if I say, okay, I hope that we would achieve, some level of decent normalcy, we've understood now, that there's always going to be a political event. That's always going to set us back 20 steps. So I'm very optimistic. I'm a positive person, but we don't have the community capacity, to make genuine changes within the 6 months. However, Ramadan is coming.
That's right. Yeah.
If something is going to unite us and in solidarity spiritually, it's the month of Ramadan. Where we come together. We suspend grievances as much as possible. And trying to at least support one another. I can't say it any other way. I don't have promising hopes for the next 6 months. I mean, if I was to go to sleep and wake up tomorrow, I'd wish we had a change in community religious leadership, but that's not going to happen. And I don't want to, sit here and think about wishful thinking.
That's right.
Okay. What was the time frame? How long?
We only have about 5 minutes.
No. How,
6 months.
Oh,
6 months.
Sorry.
6 months isn't good enough, man.
No.
Give me a year, 2.
Okay.
I'd like to see an independent Muslim organisation fighting Islamophobia, funded by the community.
So, like the Muslim vote, for example. Do you think that's a good example?
Bro, there's a bunch of my mates laughing at your question right now, not because it's a bad question, but because of my position.
Aman in Queensland, advocacy service.
Okay, sure. In that vein.
Yeah.
All right, in that vein. All right, but I have problems with MVM because there's too much liberal myths about what representative
okay.
democracy
Yeah.
is. Yeah, but khair, in that vein, community led,
something like that.
community
yeah.
mobilized.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
same with Amman and so
Community
forth.
funded.
But nevertheless, I still feel like they're mobilizing us to have a place on the table, right? I'm a little bit
Sure.
different. I'm saying build your own table. Yeah,
That makes sense.
right. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'd like to see in a year two a Muslim funded something that will generate for the next generation, yeah, a place to go if they want to take up the fight. A place to support their education, support their activism, and teach us how to pay for it. Right? And that may mean go into Muslim majority countries, embassies. Like one of the things I'm like, why are you always lobbying the Australian government?
Yeah.
Okay, I know Qatar's got issues. Why don't you lobby Malaysia, Indonesia, Qatar? Like, why are we always going to the Australian government? Yes, we're Australians. I get it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they have no role, but we have shared interests with, if we're protecting the sanctity of the deen, yeah, we have shared interests with other Muslims, right? You know, so now that's what I'd like to see. Yeah, but without overly. To conclude on a positive note, I'm not doing this just so I can counter everything I've said, because when we highlight all the problems, it's easy to lose sight. We also, I want to say, may our continued resilience continue.
Yeah.
Like we are a very resilient community,
Incredibly.
and we've done incredibly well. And we, like I know you mentioned, we do have heroes. You mentioned Rhonda as one example. We do have heroes.
Yeah.
Like we have people who, like even at the smallest gesture, Osman Khawaj are coming out. Like I'm not really into that kind of stuff, but for him to do that in the mainstream,
right.
that is amazing.
Can I make a
Yeah.
controversial
Yeah.
comment? That our special envoy for Islamophobia has made improvements.
After
You know,
all.
in no, but
Better late
wouldn't
than
that need to
never.
be celebrated?
That's right.
You
I
know,
agree.
so
I was
to
talking about
be
heroes,
fair,
but yeah, okay.
yeah, I'm
Better
going to
late than
say
never.
I've
Yeah,
been
yeah,
monitoring.
yeah.
Well, I was
Right.
like,
I've been monitoring his wording, and I'm going to say that change is welcomed and celebrated. You know,
I
so,
absolutely agree.
but yeah, so on that comment, like I think take stock, although it may be difficult. Can I just call out my daughter who's been calling me 25 times on this podcast? Talk about like, I don't know, man, about this next generation. She just wants money because she's at Woolies.
Oh,
Oh,
wow.
okay.
All
That's
right.
not hard. Actually, speaking of
patient,
daughters,
someone.
something interesting my daughter said just a few days ago. You know, she said that I have interesting conversations, you know, with Allah, with God. She goes, I keep atting him. You know how you at in social media, but I don't get a response. I said, establish your prayers, you know.
Well,
Yeah.
best time as well. Like you
Yeah.
said, Ramadan is inshallah in the next day or two. Best time to make
Ramadan
dua.
Kareem.
I mean, and on that note, I think it's a good time to end. Jazakallah khairan for everyone that has tuned in. Jazakallah khairan for your time, Dr. Yasser and Hanan. And yeah, Ramadan Mubarak to everyone. And inshallah, we'll say a part 2 to this. Who knows?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum
Wa
assalam.
alaikum.